As a contractor, do you ever experience this low level of angst that either you have too much work and you're working a ton of hours and you're kind of overwhelmed, or you're worried about not having enough work, and even when you know that you got a lot of work, there's always the worry about where's the next project or the next job going to come from? I see this a lot, and I have for years, all the way back to when I was married to a painting contractor in the 80s and 90s. And what I've learned over these many years since then in working with contractors is that it does not have to be that way, and there is a way to reduce that angst and that anxiety if you know the right numbers and the right information to pay attention to. I'm Vicki Suter with Suter Business Builders, and for over 25 years I've been helping contractors get more control over the results they create in their business, reduce that anxiety and that constant sense of worry, and give them more ability to be able to increase their profitability, have more time that they can enjoy their life, and really spend more time doing what they really love to do. And in this video, I'm going to share with you what's some ways that I have been able to do that with the clients that I've worked with, and what are some things that you can do starting right now to start to reduce that angst and anxiety. But before I jump into telling you about it, I want to share my story with you, because where this came from for me is a bit of an unusual place. In 1965, I was just a little tot. I was snuggled on the couch watching cartoons one Saturday morning, and my mom walked into the room, and as I looked up at her, I could see just like this distress on her face, and I said, "Mom, like, what's wrong?" And as she walked over, she said, "Your grandmother passed away this morning." And as she embraced me, I wept, and her words totally broke my heart. My grandmother, I adored my grandmother, and my grandmother for me was this very special human being. I come from a big Italian family. I'm the youngest of 4 children and the youngest of over 24 cousins. And so as a kid, I just didn't get paid a lot of attention to. But when I walked into my grandmother's house, my grandmother for me was like the world stopped. She paid attention to me. She saw me, and I got that she completely adored me. And at that moment when my mom told me that she had died, I was so shocked, because I didn't even know my grandmother was sick. I certainly didn't know she was dying. And at that moment, I felt like that opportunity to have been able to say goodbye to her, the opportunity to have told her how much I adored her, that opportunity to just have closure was completely taken away from me. And that whole thing of I felt like I didn't have any control. And obviously, I didn't have any control at that age. I couldn't have changed that outcome, but I could have like if I had known, right, I could have had that closure with my grandmother that I never got. And as I started to get older, and I started to work in banking and then as a controller for an international training company, I realized how that experience sort of influenced how I thought. I really gravitated to the financial world because I loved that you had the ability to know and see where you were headed before you got there. You had the ability to be able to, with the right information and the right feedback, be able to not be blindsided by things that happen in the world. You had the opportunity to have more control. And I think that, it came from that experience lots of years ago, where I think I made a decision in that little brain of mine at the time to go, I don't want to feel like I don't want to have that feeling again. I don't want to feel like I'm blindsided by decisions that other people make that limit my ability to have more control over what I can do. And so when I ended up in finance, I really saw how the numbers and the feedback allowed me to be able to see what results were coming in the future, so that there wasn't the bad surprise of that future event happening without us being able to do it with our eyes wide open, to have that clarity of what's going to happen if this continues on this track or trend, right? By being able to see trends or certain indicators. And then also to be able to then see well in advance of it being history, to be able to intervene in that and take action. And as I was married to Bill in the 80s and 90s, and I watched him struggle in his painting business, I got to thinking there has to be a way in construction that you could also see those elements. Like, what were those things that you could see and identify where you were going to end up well in advance? And so we started to develop some tools around things like estimating. Like, if I know I want to make a certain amount in revenue, that means I have to produce a certain amount of work. I have to close a certain amount of work. And in order to close a certain amount of work, I have to estimate a certain amount of work. And so that became one of the indicators that we started to look at and identify where were we headed well before it was history. And it was so interesting to watch this transformation by doing even just that one thing with him, because in our family, it was Bill and I and our son Taylor that it was such a challenge for him to be able to just relax, because he was constantly in that worry mode about either he had too much work or he was super worried about the work that was going to come. And what it resulted in was him not really being present in our family, him, having to work a lot of weekends. And it was tough. It was tough on all of us. But I saw the stress, that it constantly caused for him. And so when we started to put some of these measures in place, and I will say one of the first things that we did was to do a budget for the company, like for his business. Because if you're going to, you have to have goals against which you can measure any result. Otherwise, you're just going to be hoping and wishing. So one of the key things, and we kind of looked at it like, well, it's just like a project that you have, right? If you have a project that is coming in the future, you do a budget, you do a plan for what are the results that we want before you actually beginning working on it. So we did the same thing and applied those principles to his business. And then we looked at, okay, well, if he wants to make $1 million in revenue, then he was going to have to close that much work. And then before that, he had to bid a certain amount of work. So we started looking at what was his close rate? And his close rate was about 25%. So I said, well, then you have to bid $4 million worth of work in order to close $1 million, in order to be able to produce $1 million. So when we started to track that, now it was like, when there wasn't as much work in the pipeline of estimates, then it just begged a different question. Now, instead of worrying, he was like, well, I got to figure out a way to make the phone ring more, right? So that clarity gave him more confidence to know where specifically he needed to go take actions in order to produce a different result. And then the second thing that we started to do was to track backlog. Like that ability to be able to see how much work he had that was already in contract that was coming to the future. Now it was like, oh, okay, that work's going to run out here. Or you can't say yes to that next job because you're completely booked up until here, but you could book it after that. And so that number started to that clarity really gave him more confidence to be able to say to a customer, I'm booked up until here. Can we put it here? That ability to have more control like that for Bill was huge in terms of his sense of confidence in the way that he was managing and running his business. And the great result was two things. One, it allowed him to spend more time with his family. And when he was with us, he was completely present, which was wonderful. And then the second piece of it, that it allowed him to stop worrying. It allowed him to be more, feel like he was more in control of his business. as opposed to feeling like he was in this constant worry, which just made him a happier person. And we ultimately, like, the business ended up making more money in the long run. And it was just such a wonderful thing that as I started working with contractors, having sort of figured that out with him, that I started bringing that to the work that I do with clients and have for all of those years since then. And I've repeatedly seen it time and time again, how that ability to be able to have that clarity about your numbers, and then how that gives you more confidence to be able to take more powerful actions. So what I ask of you is, where is a place in your business what is one thing that you can start tracking, and tracking it consistently, by the way. We were very diligent about looking at those numbers consistently, week in and week out, month in and month out, in comparing those goals to the actual results, because that ability to be able to have that clarity was the thing that made it so that it just became part of how he ran his business. And it's part of how I see clients who do that consistently are much more successful, and they produce much more predictable results. So what is one thing for you that you want to go do in your business? What's some piece of information that you want to track that's going to allow you to have a greater sense of clarity, so that you can have more confidence, so that you can take more powerful actions and stop the anxiety of always worrying about, is it all going to turn out? Thanks for listening. If you would drop me a note below, I'd really love to hear what it is that you would like to do in your business in order to start having more control over the results you produce.